Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. One of the most intriguing aspects of the magical world of Harry Potter is just how carefully wizards try to keep their existence hidden from Muggles. Over the centuries, they've developed dozens, maybe even hundreds, of ways to conceal magical details from curious eyes. Yet despite all their efforts, the events of 7 books and 8 movies repeatedly set up situations that logically should have led to the wizarding world being completely exposed. Today, let's take a closer look at some moments where Muggles could have figured everything out. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Owls on Privet Drive. One of the most recognizable scenes in the first film is when dozens of owls crowd around the Dursleys' house, delivering Harry's Hogwarts letter. Birds keep arriving again and again, showering the house with letters from early morning on. Even if the neighbors didn't immediately suspect magic, a mass owl invasion in a densely populated suburban area would definitely have raised questions. Gossip about the weird house would have spread through Little Whinging in no time. Number 2. The escaped snake. Harry's first real act of magic happens at the zoo. He not only talks to a snake but makes the glass vanish, letting it slither free. A crowd of visitors immediately noticed the empty enclosure and the boy standing on the wrong side of the glass. In the books it's treated as a local incident, but in real life the zoo would have gone into an uproar. Without any ministry officials on site to wipe memories, Muggles would certainly have asked plenty of questions afterward. Number 3. Platform 934. To board the Hogwarts Express, students walk straight through a barrier at King's Cross Station. Supposedly, Ministry of Magic employees are always on hand to erase the memories of any Muggle witnesses. But big train stations never really empty out. Dozens of kids with luggage literally disappearing into a brick wall is a bit too conspicuous to go completely unnoticed, especially during the busy morning hours when the station is packed. Number 4. Aunt Marge. When Harry lost control and inflated Marjorie Dursley, her loud flight through the air couldn't have gone unnoticed. Even if the ministry quickly wiped neighbors' memories, the sight of a screaming woman floating over rooftops would surely have become an urban legend, especially since Marge wasn't just any random person, she was a relative of the Dursleys. Her disappearance and return in a very altered state would have attracted a lot of attention. Number 5. The night bus. Stan Shunpike claimed that Muggles couldn't see the night bus. In the books, that seems like a reasonable explanation, but in the films, it's shown as a massive triple-decker bus roaring along with screeching brakes, loud crashes, and the ability to shove physical objects aside. Even if it was invisible, the noise and shaking would have alarmed any passers-by. This kind of vehicle literally disrupts the peace of a sleeping city. Number 6. Apparition. Apparition, instantaneous travel from one point to another, is one of the fastest and most convenient ways for wizards to move around, but in terms of keeping magic secret, it's incredibly risky. During Bill and Fleur's wedding, Harry, Hermione and Ron escaped by apparating right onto a busy London street. In the film, their arrival looked so dramatic that any witnesses would have needed immediate memory wiping from the ministry, and it's likely this wasn't the only time something like that happened. Number 7. The Ministry of Magic entrance. One way to enter the ministry is to descend in an old phone booth or use a public restroom. Wizards go into a stall and literally flush themselves into the underground to appear in the ministry's central atrium. If you think about it, it's a weirdly conspicuous method. Muggles using the same bathroom would surely notice crowds going in but no one coming out, especially in a building with lots of random visitors. Number 8. The Quidditch World Cup. The Quidditch World Cup was meant to be invisible. Thousands of witches and wizards filled the hidden stadium. Tents stretched across the fields like a secret city. Ministry workers layered charms over everything. But the night the dark mark rose, all that magic cracked. In Goblet of Fire, Rowling writes, everywhere there were cries and screams. Tents blazed with fire. Masked Death Eaters dragged the Roberts family into the sky. Flames lit the treetops. Sparks burst above the fields. Anyone in the nearest village, Ottery St. Catchpole, could have seen the green skull glowing overhead. Imagine an elderly couple walking their dog and staring at hundreds of terrified people in robes fleeing across the fields. Even if the ministry wiped memories, some details must have slipped through. A stray photograph of a blazing tent, a rumour in the local pub, a newspaper headline that never made it to print. The chaos was too big to vanish without a trace. Number 9, the flying Ford Anglia. The turquoise Ford Anglia soared over the M25 like a stubborn blue bird. Harry clung to the window while Ron wrestled with the steering wheel. In Chamber of Secrets, Rowling writes, "Cars aren't supposed to fly, but that didn't stop them. They rattled across half of England in broad daylight. Fields and villages rolled past below. Trucks swerved on the motorway, drivers squinting up in disbelief." Somewhere over Oxford, a lorry driver named Bernard Jordan must have nearly crashed when he spotted the car bobbing above a church steeple. 100 cameras could have snapped a picture in that moment. Any newspaper, the Daily Mail, the Sun, would have paid for a photograph of a flying Ford. But in the story, no photo ever surfaced. The ministry erased memories fast, but the idea that no one kept a single blurry snapshot is almost impossible to believe. Number 10. Dementor attacks. The Dementors came gliding into Privet Drive without warning. 2 of them, their rotting hands reaching for Harry and Dudley. The air turned so cold that Harry could see his breath hanging in front of his face. In Order of the Phoenix, Rowling writes, it was as though happiness had been sucked out of the world. That feeling didn't stay neatly contained to one small alley. Dementors affect everything around them. Their despair seeps through walls. Neighbours must have felt it. Petunia Dursley was peering out her curtains when Dudley stumbled back, gasping. The street lamps flickered and died. Every window on the street would have reflected the sudden darkness. Imagine old Mrs. Figg, watching from her sitting room, gripping her cat tight as the temperature plunged. Somewhere down the block, a mother probably pulled her child inside, terrified by the unnatural chill. Afterward, when Harry cast the Patronus, a silver stag burst from his wand. It lit the street like a searchlight. The Dementors fled into the night. Even if no one saw their hooded forms, hundreds of residents surely felt that wave of misery followed by blinding silver light. But in the official record, no Muggle ever knocked on the Dursleys' door to ask why the street had frozen solid on a warm August evening. Number 11, Weasley Twins' Magical Fireworks. Fred and George Weasley never did anything halfway. In Order of the Phoenix, they set off the most spectacular fireworks Hogwarts had ever seen. Catherine wheels spun across the ceiling. Enormous dragons of fire snapped their jaws at terrified Slytherins. The book says, a gigantic serpent shot into the air, split into 1,000 stars, and fell in a shower of brilliant green sparks. It was so bright that the great hall glowed like midday. The fireworks didn't stay contained inside the castle walls. They soared high above the towers, exploding over the Forbidden Forest and the lake. Anyone in Hogsmeade who stepped outside for fresh air would have seen burning letters spelling out rude messages to Dolores Umbridge. The thunderclaps rolled across the valley. Even a Muggle shepherd grazing sheep near the edge of the wards would have heard the racket and seen the sky lit up by dragons and phoenixes of pure flame. It is almost funny to imagine the ministry trying to explain this to curious villagers. A firework display on that scale can't be hidden by a simple Muggle repelling charm. Yet no local newspaper ever printed a headline like "Mysterious Pyrotechnics Over Remote Castle." The Weasley twins' prank was supposed to humiliate a teacher, but it nearly blew the statute of secrecy apart, and no one seemed to notice. Number 12. The Battle of Hogwarts. The Battle of Hogwarts was not a quiet skirmish in a hidden corner. It was a war. Fire erupted from wands. Giants smashed the stone walls. the protective wards shattered in flashes bright enough to light the forbidden forest. In Deathly Hallows, Rolling writes, the castle grounds were ablaze with curses and curses rebounding. From the hills around the castle, anyone would have seen the towers crack and collapse. The boathouse burst into flame. Even the sky above turned red from the volleys of curses. Hogsmeade lay only a short walk from the castle gates. Shopkeepers in the Three Broomsticks must have heard the thunder of giants and the shrieks of dying creatures. Madame Rosmerta could have looked out her window and seen a dragon swooping over the battlements. When Voldemort's voice rose through the darkness, "Harry Potter is dead!" it echoed beyond the grounds. It is hard to believe that no Muggle hiker or farmer wandering too near the lake saw anything. After dawn, the castle was half in ruins. Rubble lay across the lawns. Smoke curled from shattered windows. Hundreds of bodies had to be carried out and buried. Yet no Muggle newspaper reported a catastrophe in a Scottish castle. No rescue helicopters circled overhead. The Ministry of Magic must have worked furiously to cover up the battle, but the silence from the outside world remains one of the strangest parts of the entire story. Number 13. Number 12. Grimmauld Place. Number 12. Grimmauld Place stood hidden between two soot-stained Georgian houses tucked behind the shifting bricks that concealed its door. It was Sirius Black's childhood home. Later, it became the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix. Dumbledore himself had cast the Fidelius charm to keep it secret, but magic can only do so much to disguise the oddities that unfolded on that quiet London street. Neighbours along Grimmauld Place must have wondered why they sometimes heard muffled shouting through the walls, or why stray cats bolted when the doors seemed to grow from the bricks. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry describes how the building squeezed itself into existence, groaning against the iron drain pipes. Every time the Order held a meeting, hooded figures arrived and vanished. Remus Lupin, with his tired face and patched robes, Mad-Eye Moody clunking along on his wooden leg and swivelling his magical eye. Tonks with her hair changing colour in the lamplight. Anyone peering through their curtains would have seen these strangers appear out of nowhere. And not all of them were subtle. Moody once growled, "Constant vigilance?" loud enough for Harry to hear it from upstairs. It is hard to imagine that a nosy pensioner next door never picked up the telephone to report suspicious gatherings. Imagine the late evenings when the Order returned from missions. Molly Weasley hurrying up the steps with bandages, Arthur whispering about Dementor sightings. The door would swing open onto darkness that looked deeper than any normal hallway. Even the Muggles must have sensed the chill. A place can radiate secrets so thick that no curtain or brick can hide them. Grimmauld Place was that kind of house. There was also Creature, Sirius's surly old house elf. He slipped outside more than once to mutter insults or fetch something foul from the bins. If a neighbour glimpsed a creature with bat-like ears scuttling past the railings, it would have raised questions. But in Rowling's world, the Muggle inhabitants of London apparently preferred to pretend nothing unusual ever happened on their own street. Number 14. Escape from Gringotts on a Dragon. Harry, Ron, and Hermione did something no one had ever dared. They broke into Gringotts, the safest bank in the wizarding world, and stole Hufflepuff's cup right from Bellatrix Lestrange's vault. But the heist was not the most shocking part. What followed was a scene so spectacular that even the most distracted Muggle should have looked up in disbelief. They mounted the pale, half-blind dragon chained in the depths. The creature burst through the marble ceiling, raining stone and gold across Diagon Alley. In Deathly Hallows, Rowling describes it vividly. With a deafening, ear-splitting roar, the dragon forced itself upwards, through the roof, showering the goblins with rubble. The dragon rose over the rooftops, its massive wings beating the air with thunderous gusts. Anyone strolling along Charing Cross Road, or glancing out the windows of the Leaky Cauldron, would have seen it. Muggles in the City of London were surely caught in the swirling wind and clouds of dust as the beast cleared the skyline. Imagine the commuters on the Millennium Bridge pausing mid-step to stare at the pale shape flying past St. Paul's Cathedral. This was no passing shadow or trick of the light. It was a monstrous creature with scales like cracked parchment and a tail that could crush a car. If any event should have shattered the statute of secrecy, it was this. The dragon did not vanish into thin air. It soared over London, soaring higher and higher, leaving behind a trail of smoke and fire, as Hermione clung to Harry's arm. News outlets would have gone mad for a headline like "Winged Monster Terrorizes the Thames." CCTV cameras cover every block of the financial district. Yet in the books and films, not a single reporter seemed to notice. It is almost comical to picture the Ministry of Magic hurrying to erase every eyewitness memory before nightfall. But thousands must have glimpsed it. The tourists in Trafalgar Square, the security guards at the Gherkin, the children on river cruises below Tower Bridge, all of them with their mouths open, watching 3 teenagers vanish on the back of an ancient dragon. Number 15, Triwizard Tournament visitors. The summer preceding the Triwizard Tournament arrived with a kind of quiet intensity that seemed, to any observant Muggle eye, almost like the hush before an unseen storm. The tiny village of Hogsmeade, the nearest settlement to Hogwarts, had always existed on the periphery of local curiosity, spoken of in hushed tones, referred to with rolling eyes or vague shrugs. Yet that year it was as if every oddity previously ignored became magnified tenfold. Muggle residents of nearby hamlets like Upper Flagley and Little Norton began to notice a startling influx of strangers carrying weathered trunks and sporting cloaks in deep emerald and gleaming navy. The station master at the tiny railway stop remembered dozens of unfamiliar names scribbled in the ledger. One elderly villager claimed she had never seen so many people who refused to make eye contact, instead clutching odd, snake-headed canes or polished wooden walking sticks that glowed faintly at dusk. The Quidditch World Cup had already stretched the limits of Muggle obliviousness, but the tournament, with its months-long duration, created a sustained pressure that ought to have cracked even the most thorough concealment charms. Hogwarts itself lay hidden, invisible to Muggle perception, and yet the roads approaching the castle filled with foot traffic unlike any year before. Small motor coaches bearing Bulgarian flags pulled to the side of winding lanes, their occupants alighting in swirling black cloaks. French witches from Beaubaton walked in tightly clustered groups, their high, elegant collars bobbing above polished boots. An entire encampment of Durmstrang supporters was rumoured to have commandeered a ruined priory not 5 miles from the school, attracting the curious stares of passing hikers. The villagers began to trade stories in the pub, that the ancient walls glowed at night, that strange music floated from the rafters, that some peculiar convocation was taking place. Even if the villagers could not have guessed that dragons would soon be flown in under cover of night, or that a boy named Harry Potter would face them alone in a great stone arena, surely they must have sensed the surge of activity. In Goblet of Fire, Rowling writes, "The enchanted ceiling was dark and stormy-looking. Hundreds of faces turned toward the goblet. That ceiling was the merest symbol of all the magic so painstakingly concealed within those ramparts." Yet outside the castle, evidence seeped through in 1,000 little ways. Children wandering too far into the hills glimpsed shadows that shouldn't have existed. Elderly dog walkers swore that cloaked shapes flickered between the trees. Local constables were called to investigate suspicious gatherings, only to be waved off with a smile and a mumbled explanation they forgot as soon as they heard it. It was perhaps the steady accumulation of small irregularities, rather than any single spectacular event, that should have shattered the illusion for Muggle Britain. Over the months, odd deliveries were reported by the drivers who served the region. Shipments of vast quantities of flame-proof cloth, crates of shrieking, clawing animals muffled under layers of burlap, glass vials of brilliant liquid with labels in Cyrillic script. No one could explain why these shipments were unloaded near the abandoned roads leading toward the lake. A lorry driver named Clive Haskins later said he never forgot the expression on a tall man's face when he tried to peek into a crate. The man raised one gloved finger to his lips, and Clive, in a bewildering rush of embarrassment, simply looked away. He never asked again. The innkeeper of the Hog's Head, Aberforth Dumbledore, though no Muggle would have recognized the name, observed the steady parade of foreigners with undisguised skepticism. Among wizards he was known for his grudging hospitality, but to Muggle eyes the trickle of travellers moving in and out of his establishment became another source of gossip. The local postmistress complained that dozens of letters arrived bearing no return address and written in spidery ink on parchment. She handed them over with a frown, whispering to her sister that the village was crawling with cultists. At no time did the Ministry of Magic consider that a proper investigation would connect these observations to Hogwarts and the tournament beyond. When the Durmstrang ship rose out of the lake, towering above the waters like some mythical sea creature, even those Muggles who never strayed near the grounds should have heard the noise. It was a moment designed to awe the wizarding world, a demonstration of magical prowess that defied ordinary explanation. Yet it left no trace on the consciousness of local residents, as though the very air had been bewitched to carry no echoes. The same could be said of Madame Maxime's carriage, a colossal powder-blue chariot drawn by 12 winged horses the size of elephants. As the hooves smashed into the frosty grass and the carriage door swung open, it seemed impossible that any Muggle surveillance satellite or passing rambler with binoculars could have failed to notice. And yet no report surfaced in any Muggle newspaper. The concealment worked perfectly. This, in truth, is what makes the Triwizard Tournament invasion of the Scottish Highlands so chilling from a Muggle perspective. For months, Hogwarts became a centre of diplomatic ceremony, with envoys exchanging rare gifts and carrying crested scrolls sealed in wax. Wizards from as far as Romania arrived to inspect the dragons. Delegations from the Department of Magical Games and Sports tramped in and out under the pretense of routine inspections. Though no one ever explained what was being inspected, in the book Bagman cheerfully announces the champions are about to be chosen. He might as well have declared that a hidden world was about to declare itself because the tournament was too large, too flamboyant to remain a secret indefinitely. Number 16. Enchanted Underground and Portals. The London Underground had always been a place of convergence where thousands of unsuspecting Muggles brushed shoulders with wizards in hurried anonymity. There were days when Arthur Weasley, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, would marvel at the Muggles' obliviousness as he slipped through a hidden archway between platforms 9 and 10, a space that appeared as a maintenance corridor to any mundane observer. Yet the curious thing was not simply that these portals existed, but that no one ever seemed to see them in action. One might expect that in a city bristling with CCTV cameras and smartphones, a disappearing wizard would eventually be caught on tape. But the Muggle world remained resolutely unaware, as though an entire population had agreed to avert its gaze from the impossible. Consider the morning when Kingsley Shacklebolt, in his deep blue robes, was forced to apparate hurriedly after an urgent owl arrived with news of a Death Eater sighting near Tottenham Court Road. He chose a quiet corner of the Holborn station platform, knowing it would be the fastest way to reach the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement. As he twisted into nothingness with a soft crack, a woman in a bright red coat looked directly at him, blinking in confusion. Her hand twitched toward her handbag, where a mobile phone nestled among tissues and lipsticks, and yet by the time she had the presence of mind to retrieve the device, her memory had curdled into something vague, the recollection of the event melting like morning frost. The Ministry's Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes had dispatched an obliviator within minutes. A single tap of a wand erased all clarity from her mind, reducing a miraculous disappearance to a forgettable lapse in attention. It was a testament to wizarding ingenuity that the barriers between worlds endured, but even ingenuity had its limits. When Harry Potter himself began working in the Auror office, he often wondered at the fragility of the masquerade. The Ministry had once installed a concealed revolving door behind a grimy advertising billboard at Charing Cross Station. A wizard would simply walk toward the poster, featuring a smiling insurance broker, and vanish through it as though the wall were no more solid than a fog. It was a trick of perception, Hermione Granger once explained in the department's archives, her finger trailing over a document outlining the Muggle-repelling charms layered upon the site. But she had admitted in a rare moment of unease that the charms were not infallible. "Muggles are cleverer than we credit," she had written in a marginal note, a line that spoke volumes about the hidden risk. There was a day, unrecorded in any official log, when a small boy named Anthony Mills actually ran into the barrier himself. He had been chasing a pigeon along the Victoria Line platform when he collided headlong with a wizard mid-passage. For a split second, Anthony saw a shimmering oval of golden light like the surface of a pond struck by sunlight. He let out a shriek so piercing it startled several commuters. The wizard, a minor clerk from the Department of Magical Transportation, named Edgar Fleet, panicked and lost hold of his wand. A porter found Anthony moments later, still hiccuping tears and babbling about the golden doorway that swallowed the man whole. The boy's mother hustled him away, convinced he had imagined it. By the time anyone thought to question the story, obliviators had already swept the platform, their spells sluicing away the truth. No record survives of the number of mobile phone videos that must have captured such phenomena. In an age when every commuter possessed a camera, it defied all logic to assume none had ever filmed the moment a witch in travelling cloaks walked straight into a blank wall. But each time, Ministry officials claimed the same explanation: confundus charms to cloud perception, obliviate incantations to scour memories, and subtle jinxes woven into the very structure of the underground. The cumulative effect was a collective blindness so pervasive that it appeared almost deliberate. Muggles, it seemed, became complicit in their own ignorance, persuaded by the spellwork that their senses had betrayed them. The incident at King's Cross Station, when Arthur Weasley escorted Harry to the Ministry for a disciplinary hearing, offered another small crack in the illusion. As they passed the barriers, Harry felt the familiar lurch of magic rippling through the air. A tall man in a pinstriped suit stood nearby, tapping out a text message. For the briefest moment, his gaze lifted, and he stared straight at the place where Arthur was vanishing. His eyebrows drew together in a puzzled crease, and his phone dangled forgotten. Later, Harry would remember that look, an expression of dawning comprehension, the moment before a mind is forcibly scrubbed clean. He saw us, Harry had thought. Heart hammering, but the memory faded for that man like a half-remembered dream, one he could never retrieve no matter how hard he tried. The magical concealment extended beyond doorways and hidden arches. Certain trains themselves were bewitched to host portals to magical destinations. On the central line, there was said to be a compartment that never opened for Muggle passengers, but slid open for witches and wizards, revealing a brass staircase spiraling down into an underground annex of the Leaky Cauldron. Hermione once cited a regulation from magical transit law and enchantments, cautioning that this train must never be allowed to break down or be diverted onto a maintenance track, where engineers might blunder into it unawares. Yet even such elaborate safeguards could not account for every stray glance or curious photograph. The belief that no Muggle had ever stumbled upon these details relied as much on wishful thinking as on spells. Number 17, Shops of Diagon Alley. In the heart of Muggle London stood the Leaky Cauldron, a dingy old pub with a faded sign and grimy windows, sandwiched between a record shop and a big bookstore. J.K. Rowling describes it as a place for the wizards, but open to all, an establishment where witches and wizards slipped in unnoticed, cloaked by a thick haze of disregard from ordinary passers-by. Yet the pub was no illusion. It existed in the same world as London cab drivers and tourists with cameras dangling from their necks. One might have expected that even in a city as busy as London, at least a handful of curious Muggles would have walked through its crooked doorway out of idle curiosity. They would have discovered a bar lined with patrons in flowing robes, the air scented with pipe smoke and spiced mead, and most unsettling of all, a brick wall that parted like the Red Sea when tapped in just the right sequence. It is almost incomprehensible that no bewildered Muggle ever stumbled in to witness this phenomenon. Consider the day when Harry Potter first followed Rubeus Hagrid into the leaky cauldron. The scene in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone tells us it was broad daylight. People in the street didn't glance at it, Rowling writes, as if indifference alone could erase reality. But the door itself was tangible, and the clink of its bell must have sounded the same in any ear. Hagrid, a man the size of two normal humans, ushered a skinny boy in ragged clothes across the threshold. Inside, the crowd erupted in delighted recognition of Harry's lightning-shaped scar. Wizards crowded around him, shaking his hand and beaming. The scene was so lively that a tourist who had simply wandered in to ask directions would have found themselves pressed against a wall, astonished by pointed hats and cauldrons, and the word Muggle muttered like a slur. How did no curious Muggle ever notice the commotion? The most perplexing moment of all came after Hagrid guided Harry to the small courtyard behind the pub. There, in full view of anyone who cared to look, he produced a pink umbrella and began tapping the bricks. Rowling writes, "The brick he had touched quivered, it wriggled in the middle, a small hole appeared, it grew wider and wider. A second later they were facing an archway wide enough even for Hagrid. Stones shifted noisily as the arch expanded, revealing a cobblestone alley bursting with moving shop signs and witches hurrying about with owl cages. Any Muggle peering out of a grimy window or pushing open the back door for fresh air would have seen this impossible gateway bloom out of a solid wall. Even if they could not cross the threshold, the mere vision of the bricks contorting themselves would have been unforgettable. Imagine for a moment that a young woman named Eleanor Pritchard, a freelance journalist for the Evening Standard, happened to be there that afternoon. She could have been meeting a contact for an interview on the state of second-hand bookshops or simply taking shelter from a sudden drizzle. She might have ordered a cup of tea, oblivious to the strangeness around her, until she caught sight of a lumbering man in a moleskin overcoat tapping bricks, with what looked suspiciously like a parasol. Eleanor, a practical woman who prided herself on noticing details others overlooked, would have been transfixed, even if the archway itself shimmered out of her memory. Minutes later, obliterated by protective charms, there remains the question of how the initial scene could pass unremarked. Would she really have returned to her desk that evening without scribbling a note in her reporter's notebook? The wizarding world's reliance on Muggle apathy feels like the most precarious magic of all. Diagon Alley's entrance did not vanish instantly behind Harry and Hagrid. The brick wall stood open for long enough that any curious Muggle could have caught a glimpse of the first few shops. A cauldron shop with gleaming brass pots stacked high, the apothecary exhaling pungent clouds of herbs and ollivanders, its single wand glinting in a velvet-lined window. No spells are ever mentioned that cause the sounds of the shops to disappear, and there is no indication that Muggles would be deaf to the clamour. A disbelieving onlooker might have heard the rattle of coins as wizards purchased potion ingredients, or the hoot of an owl escaping its cage. One wonders why no local gossip column ever carried a piece titled "Is There a Hidden Market in Central London?" with a shaky photograph of a brick wall mid-transformation. Some readers point out that the leaky cauldron itself is protected by charms that dull the attention of passers-by. Yet this enchantment seems implausibly thorough. Even the most powerful Notice Me Not spell should occasionally fail in a city where thousands of pedestrians pass by each day. Local authorities surely had cause to notice an establishment that never filed tax records and hosted patrons in pointed hats. Over the centuries, at least one tax inspector or constable must have pushed open that door. And once inside, could he truly have ignored the spectacle? Wizards poring over copies of the Daily Prophet, the clatter of gold galleons on the bar, none of it should have blended seamlessly into a Muggle's worldview. It is far easier to believe that some did see and simply decided not to speak out of confusion or fear of ridicule. Number 18. Street Duels in London. In the darkest years of Voldemort's return, there was a particular night when the fragile barrier between the Muggle world and the hidden realm of magic nearly collapsed entirely. The Death Eaters, emboldened by their triumphs and certain that fear alone would secure their power, launched an assault in the very heart of London. This was not a distant skirmish in the Forbidden Forest or a hidden ambush in Knockturn Alley. It was an all-out magical duel that erupted along the crowded avenues near the Thames, beneath rows of surveillance cameras and in full view of thousands of unsuspecting Muggles. One might expect that this event would be seared forever into the collective memory of the city. Yet in J.K. Rowling's Deathly Hallows, there is only the briefest mention of such battles, with no sign that the Muggle authorities ever recognized what had unfolded in plain sight. As Hermione Granger later recalled with disbelief, the Death Eaters sent curses arching through the air like flaming comets. Spells smashed windows and overturned parked cars. She described in a strained voice how Antonin Dolohov's jet of purple flame detonated a lamppost, showering sparks onto a terrified crowd of night shift workers leaving an office building. "People screamed," she said in the book, "and then they just ran." The notion that hundreds of Muggles could witness that spectacle without comprehension challenges even the most charitable interpretations of ministry efficiency. The statute of secrecy had survived for centuries on the premise that wizarding conflicts were hidden from Muggle eyes. But on that night, the statute cracked wide open. The example most often cited by historians of the Second Wizarding War was the duel between Yaxley and Kingsley Shacklebolt, which took place on Westminster Bridge. A black-robed figure hurled a blasting curse that struck the parapet, tearing chunks of stone free and sending them crashing into the river below. Yaxley fired a streak of green light, an unmistakable killing curse, and Kingsley countered with a shield charm so bright it bathed the entire bridge in dazzling silver. Any Londoner driving across at that hour, or any pedestrian who glanced up from a mobile phone, would have seen two men locked in combat, one attempting to murder the other in cold blood with a wand. It is almost inconceivable that every witness could have been obliviated before dawn. Beyond the Muggles themselves, there were other, more unmanageable witnesses, security cameras. Even in 1997, London was blanketed by CCTV, particularly in sensitive areas like Westminster and the Embankment. The cameras did not blink when curses exploded or bodies levitated above the pavement. There is no passage in the books explaining how the Ministry managed to confiscate or erase every scrap of footage. If a Muggle detective or technician had reviewed the recordings before the Obliviators arrived, the entire masquerade might have ended then and there. And yet the narrative never acknowledges that possibility, as if the cameras simply failed to notice what they were. Built to capture. Consider the moment when the Death Eaters pursued Harry, Ron, and Hermione down Charing Cross Road. The text recounts how thick jets of flame engulfed a taxi, forcing it to screech sideways into a storefront window. Harry, wand raised, flung a stunning spell that sent a masked figure crashing into a mailbox. The sheer volume of destruction, smashed glass, overturned cars, magical fire, would have demanded explanation even if no one recognized the spells themselves. Fire brigades and police would have converged within minutes, but in the book the trio simply disapparate, leaving behind wreckage that no Muggle seems able to describe later. Some fans have speculated that the Ministry maintained teams of obliviators on 24-hour standby, racing to every incident in enchanted vans to clean memories as quickly as they formed. Perhaps there were hundreds of such operatives, each charged with scouring a different borough of the city. Yet this solution raises more questions than it answers. Obliviate is a delicate spell prone to erasing more than intended. The idea that so many terrified witnesses could be systematically pacified and rendered docile strains belief. Even a single slip, one person who remembered what they had seen, could have become the first credible whistleblower to expose the magical world. Nor was the damage confined to a few isolated skirmishes. According to Kingsley Shacklebolt, during Voldemort's reign, there were at least a dozen large-scale attacks in Muggle districts. "They want everyone to feel unsafe," he said grimly. If even one of those attacks happened on a crowded high street in broad daylight, the consequences for secrecy would have been catastrophic. A memory charm cannot erase the smoke that lingers for hours or the scorch marks etched into buildings. The next day, Muggle newspapers must have carried photographs of charred facades and shattered shop windows. One wonders how the Ministry's press office spun such events into palatable stories. Fred and George Weasley recounted with a mixture of awe and frustration how Dolohov and Roll brought down an entire bus shelter on Tottenham Court Road. The twins were under invisibility cloaks attempting to drag a wounded Aura to safety. Spells ricocheted so wildly that a lorry burst into flames, sending a pillar of black smoke rising above Soho. "It looked like a bomb had gone off," George would say later. And in truth, that is almost certainly what the Muggle authorities decided to believe. The War on Terror had primed Londoners to accept any catastrophe as the work of extremists with explosives rather than wizards with wands. Yet in the quiet hours afterward, it is hard not to imagine that some of the bystanders retained glimmers of recognition. An old woman in a headscarf who saw a masked man levitating above the pavement. A teenager who swore he watched a man vanish into thin air. A police constable who reached for a gun but found himself suddenly forgetting why he had drawn it. These moments haunt the margins of the story. They remind us that magic was never quite as invisible as the statute required. It was only ever concealed by the complicity of memory and the convenience of forgetting. One of the most unsettling details appears in Hermione's recollection of their flight from the cafe ambush. As she describes it in Deathly Hallows, the dark shapes of Death Eaters blurred in and out of sight, moving faster than any human should. She felt sure that at least half a dozen passers-by saw something they could never explain, and that fear itself, more than any spell, would keep them silent. Terror is the oldest kind of magic, and it does not require a wand. There is also the matter of collateral injuries. When spells explode in public spaces, they do not only harm the intended targets. Muggle bystanders could have been struck by debris or indirect curses. Even if they could not name the cause, they would have described their injuries in emergency rooms across London. If every nurse, doctor, and patient in those hospitals was obliviated in turn, the Ministry's reach was truly limitless, but such total control over the chaos of war feels more like propaganda than reality. Moreover, the Muggle authorities were not composed entirely of fools. If Scotland Yard detectives or MI5 analysts compared notes on unexplained incidents, eventually a pattern would emerge. A forensic team dispatched to a scene with melted tarmac and no chemical accelerants would record their findings. A pathologist would note that a corpse bore no wounds consistent with bullets or knives. How many such reports were filed, only to vanish into Ministry vaults? This unspoken infrastructure of secrecy is never detailed in the novels, yet it must have existed or the masquerade would have ended. The greatest irony is that Voldemort himself had little interest in preserving that masquerade. As he gained power, his attacks grew bolder and more public. His Death Eaters thrived on spectacle and dread. It was only the surviving faction of the Ministry and the Order of the Phoenix who still believed it mattered to keep Muggles in ignorance. One can almost imagine Voldemort laughing at the thought of a terrified Muggle newsreader stammering through a broadcast about unexplained explosions, knowing no one could ever reveal the truth. Even among wizards, there were those who questioned whether the Statute of Secrecy could survive such a sustained onslaught. Arthur Weasley, always fascinated by Muggle technology, worried aloud that sooner or later one of their cameras will show too much. His fears proved prescient. The fact that no grainy footage ever emerged, no tape slipped to a tabloid reporter, feels less like a plausible outcome and more like a necessary contrivance to preserve the integrity of the magical world's illusions. Number 19. Giants in Britain. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, there is a short but telling moment when Hagrid speaks of his failed mission to recruit the giants. They're not exactly the most subtle of creatures. The text states the giants were living high up in the mountains, but that Voldemort's envoys reached them. Later, it is said that many sided with Voldemort, and in Deathly Hallows they fight for him. The books mention them only sporadically, as if these enormous beings somehow slipped into Britain without anyone noticing. But giants, described as 20 feet tall in Order of the Phoenix, would have left marks impossible to ignore in the Muggle world. Their feet alone would crush bracken, flatten undergrowth, break stone walls that divide sheep pastures. They would have been seen from miles away on the misty hills of Scotland or the fields of Wales, their silhouettes stark against the horizon, too large to mistake for any known animal. Even at a distance, Muggle hikers or farmers would have taken photographs, shared rumours, and called in local constables to investigate the massive footprints or flattened cottages. The books are silent on how this didn't happen, leaving us to imagine a Ministry of Magic working overtime with memory charms or confundus spells, erasing evidence with a desperation no one ever describes in detail. In Order of the Phoenix, the giants are said to have once lived in Britain before being forced to the mountains. This history suggests the land itself still bears scars of giant habitation, collapsed stone circles, or ancient causeways that scholars attribute to Celts or Druids. When Voldemort lured giants back into action, one imagines them retracing old paths, sleeping in glens carved by generations of their kind, leaving fresh scars on land already marked by their ancient passage. And yet not even the Daily Prophet suggests that the Muggle press is asking questions about why a remote Scottish croft was flattened in the night, or why livestock were found crushed, or trees split as though by lightning with no storm on record. The Ministry's obliviators are mentioned in passing elsewhere, but not in this context. We're left to fill in the blank, a whole secret corps wandering the countryside, intercepting Muggle reporters, rewriting police logs, erasing CCTV footage, silencing entire towns if necessary. This too remains unspoken in canon. Consider Deathly Hallows, where Rowling notes giants were smashing through the castle's defenders in the Battle of Hogwarts. It's an awe-inspiring but very local moment confined to one night on school grounds. But those giants had to get there. How did they cross Britain? Did they ride the Hogwarts Express? Obviously not. Even apparition is ruled out. Giants are said to be incapable of most magic. Their journey must have been slow, deliberate, and physical, through villages and fields, across roads and rivers, leaving wreckage in their wake. Imagine a giant wading across the River Severn, the current pushing against its knees, the water roiling and flooding nearby banks, scaring fishermen who phone local news desks about the monster they saw. Nothing in the books accounts for these hundreds of miles of travel. There is no mention of squibs or Muggle-born witches raising alarms about entire woodlands being levelled overnight, or small towns evacuated after someone claims to have seen a walking hill. The wizards themselves appear to regard giants as nearly uncontrollable. In Half-Blood Prince, Hagrid says, most of them joined you-know-who, suggesting no real command structure beyond crude intimidation. One imagines these giants wandering off mission, getting lost on the moors, hungry and belligerent, slaughtering livestock or smashing barns. Even if Voldemort sent Death Eaters to guide them, how many fields would they trample in their sleep? How many stone cottages would they accidentally demolish if they used them for shelter? Muggle landowners would find hoof-deep craters that don't match any vehicle, toppled dry stone walls, and entire sheepfolds emptied by sheer terror. Local councils might think at first it was teenagers with sledgehammers, but no mundane explanation could really satisfy the scale of damage giants would cause. One might imagine the Ministry's obliviators in a grim routine, arriving at dawn to find a Muggle family sobbing because their home is a ruin, their fields churned into mud. The lead obliviator would confer with his team, wands at the ready, and say, "Standard giant protocol, obliviate, repair." They'd erase memories, mend walls, regrow crops with spells, rewrite insurance records. But this is speculation the books do not explore. There's never a mention in Deathly Hallows of the Ministry's collapse leading to any such slip. Even as the Ministry falls to Death Eater control, we hear no rumour of Muggle newspapers printing. Sensational headlines about a 20-foot creature seen near Inverness. Harry hears of attacks on Muggles, of torture and killings, but not of unexplained footprints. The narrative omits the messiest questions about maintaining secrecy on that scale. It is not only the giants themselves who would be hard to conceal, but the consequences of their violence. In Order of the Phoenix, the giants killed each other in factional disputes. Their numbers were already reduced by infighting. Imagine then, Voldemort's giants fighting among themselves on British soil, settling grudges in some deserted valley. Their brawls would be visible from passing cars on rural roads, the noise echoing like thunder. The ground would be gouged into craters, streams rerouted by the force of falling bodies. If even one of them died in Britain, there would be a corpse the size of a small cottage, too big to hide easily. Yet we hear nothing of wizards dragging such remains up mountains or burning them in secret pyres, nothing of Muggle hikers stumbling on bones the size of telegraph poles. We do have precedent in the books for wizards worrying about secrecy on a much smaller scale. In Goblet of Fire, Arthur Weasley panics when Muggle campsite owners see odd wizard tents. The Ministry launches an enormous operation to control Muggle memories after the Quidditch World Cup disaster, when Death Eaters attack and the Dark Mark is conjured in the sky. Obliviators work for days to suppress rumours. That event involves mere hundreds of wizards, so how would that same Ministry handle creatures towering 20 feet tall? The Obliviators would need to fan out over half of Britain, covering every road, farm and village in a radius of miles. The logistical nightmare of this goes unmentioned. Rowling tells us giants are not the brightest, meaning they wouldn't even bother hiding their tracks. Muggles would see them even more easily than they see suspicious wizards camping in tents. The magical world is described as layered atop the Muggle one, hidden in plain sight, but dependent on human fallibility to stay unnoticed. In Prisoner of Azkaban, the night bus hurtles through London, squeezing between Muggle double-decker buses unseen. There, Rowling explains the magical concealment as an effect built into the bus itself, like a cloaking device. But giants are biological creatures with no magical stealth. No one suggests they have disillusionment charms, and they are too stupid to cast them if they did. Every step they took would be an advertisement of their existence. A giant crossing a hedgerow would leave it in ruin. A giant stepping on a lane would leave a pothole the size of a car. Even if Obliviators tried to keep up, their spellwork would have to be industrial scale and constant. It is also telling that Hagrid, himself half-giant, is noticed immediately in the Muggle world. In Philosopher's Stone, Vernon Dursley describes him as a giant, though he's only about twice the height of a man. At the hut on the rock, Harry sees Hagrid and says he's almost twice as tall as a normal man and at least 5 times as wide. If Hagrid causes such alarm in a single encounter, full-blooded giants should be impossible to keep secret. Muggles would not just forget them after a single memory charm. They would photograph them, spread rumours, contact the BBC. Whole communities would trade stories of the giant in the woods, and local authorities would investigate, leading to coverage in tabloids and speculation about cryptids or escaped elephants. Rowling avoids these complications by not describing them at all. There is no mention in Half-Blood Prince or Deathly Hallows of Muggles noticing entire forests flattened or roads blocked by massive footprints. When giants arrive at Hogwarts to fight, it is as if they emerged from nowhere. The narrative zooms in on the school grounds, ignoring the hundreds of miles they would have needed to cross. Even if Death Eaters led them at night, they would have needed food, shelter, and rest. They would have had to cross rivers and climb fences and go through tunnels, all of which would have been obliterated by their sheer size. In Order of the Phoenix, the giants are said to have lived in clans in mountains far away, implying they're unused to human proximity. Bringing them to Britain's tightly settled landscape would be like unleashing elephants in Surrey. Local people would notice. Even if Voldemort bribed them with gifts or threatened them with magic, they'd still blunder around the countryside. One might picture Death Eaters trying to keep them quiet, using silencing charms to muffle their roars, disillusionment charms on entire bodies. But these solutions are never described. The giants are presented as background menace, not a true infiltration problem. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore says Voldemort tried to get them on his side again, and Hagrid confirms most of them did. But there's no mention of what it cost. Did Voldemort need to set up supply chains for giant-sized food? Did he conjure it? Did Death Eaters haul livestock in the dark? None of this appears on the page, yet if even one giant went hungry, it would raid a farm, slaughter cattle, eat crops whole. Muggle farmers would find bloodied fields and slaughtered sheep, and local authorities would be baffled, but none of this happens in the text. It seems Rowling simply does not want to describe the giant problem in Muggle Britain. She hints at giants as a threat to wizard-kind useful shock troops in war, but never shows the costs of moving them across a land filled with highways and CCTV cameras. In an age when Muggles have phones, drones, and satellite imaging, it is implausible that giants would cross Scotland or Wales unnoticed. Even in the 90s, Muggles had enough surveillance to notice massive tracks. The Ministry's efforts to keep the wizarding world hidden would have been pushed to their limit. Obliviators would have been working triple shifts. None of that is in the books. Instead, the giants are treated like mythological boogeymen who appear at the final battle and then vanish from narrative responsibility. It is an unresolved tension in the series. Rowling gives us a richly imagined magical society, but sometimes glosses over the consequences of her own world-building. The giants are an excellent example. They exist in legend, in the margins of wizarding history, and then as shock troops for Voldemort. But their physical reality is so extreme that the books should have had to deal with the Muggle reaction. Instead, there's a narrative sleight of hand. As readers, we're asked not to look too hard at how you hide a 20-foot soldier in Britain's green and pleasant land. The silence is deafening, leaving us to wonder how many obliviators it takes to cover the tracks of a giant. Number 20. Magical pets in wizard homes. In the dim light of dawn, when the grounds of Hogwarts lay wrapped in a soft Scottish mist, few could imagine that behind the castle walls, creatures from 100 nightmares and 1,000 legends were fed, petted, and housed without any barrier separating them from the Muggle world beyond the lake and forest. It is peculiar to consider how many times these beasts came close to exposure, and yet the fragile veil between the two worlds remained unbroken. Among the most striking examples was the Norwegian ridgeback dragon named Norbert, who began his life in a wooden crate tucked behind Hagrid's fireplace. Norbert was no docile creature. He grew rapidly, belching fire with a screech so loud that it rattled the windows of Hagrid's hut. In Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Rowling writes, "The baby dragon flared its nostrils and gave a roar, a sound so loud it drowned out the howling of the wind outside." Such a roar could scarcely have gone unnoticed by any Muggle ramblers crossing the Forbidden Forest's edge or curious villagers out for an evening stroll. Hagrid's enthusiasm for monstrous pets did not end with Norbert. Buckbeak, the proud hippogriff with steel-grey feathers and lion's haunches, grazed openly in the paddocks beside the castle. The students were instructed to bow before approaching it, but the creature was hardly restrained behind high walls or enchantments to prevent accidental sighting. The mere presence of a beast with wings strong enough to lift a grown man would surely have left traces. Visible to Muggle eyes, deep claw marks in the turf, bones of rabbits scattered across the grass, perhaps even molted feathers of unnatural size, yet there is no mention of the nearby Muggle communities reporting sightings of what could easily be described as a giant eagle-horse hybrid. When Harry first met Buckbeak, rolling notes, it was staring at him with large, brilliantly orange eyes. One might wonder how many other eyes, ordinary, unmagical eyes, were ever turned towards that paddock and saw more than they could comprehend. The Ministry of Magic maintained an entire department dedicated to the concealment of magical creatures, but their methods often seem implausibly efficient. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was staffed with witches and wizards who specialized in memory charms and elaborate cover stories, but even they must have struggled to keep every incident quiet. For example, in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Newt Scamander describes how even a modestly sized murtlap, essentially a rat, with sea anemone growths on its back, can wreak havoc in a Muggle neighborhood by gnawing through doors and wailing in the night. If such creatures were loose, as they sometimes were at Hogwarts, it defies belief that the Muggle postman or travelling tradesman never glimpsed something that forced them to question reality. One need only consider the incident of the escaped blast-ended Scroots, Hagrid's hybrid creation that combined the worst qualities of scorpions and firecrabs. These creatures grew up to 6 feet long, emitted foul-smelling smoke, and exploded without warning. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Rowling writes, "The smell was worse than ever, a mixture of burning rubber and rotting fish." This stench wafted through the grounds for weeks. The castle itself was set high on a cliff, but the valley beyond belonged to ordinary Scottish farmland. Did no Muggle shepherd ever follow the stench to its source and stumble upon a crater smoking gently in the grass, or a Scroot wriggling in the bracken? It seems unlikely that obliviators could arrive quickly enough each time to erase all recollection of such an outrageous discovery. Hogsmeade, the only all-wizarding village in Britain, was a place brimming with magical wildlife and commerce. Yet it stood so near to Muggle settlements that it would have taken only a single hiker to lose the path and wander into Zonkos or Honeydukes, where chocolate frogs hopped across the counters. Imagine the delivery vans that must have driven the lanes between the villages, while protective charms might have caused drivers to look away or become suddenly disinterested. It remains extraordinary that no Muggle ever questioned the spires and chimneys. Clustered behind those hedgerows, the Ministry's faith in the disillusionment charm borders on hubris when measured against the constant noise and bustle of a place like Hogsmeade, especially during holidays when hundreds of students roamed the shops carrying shrieking packages and owl cages. Dragons, of course, were among the most dangerous creatures to keep hidden. The Triwizard Tournament brought 4 of them into the very heart of Hogwarts grounds. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the Hungarian horntail was described as the most vicious of all dragons, a creature whose roar could be heard from the castle battlements. The idea that such a beast could be transported across Europe and housed in a magically camouflaged enclosure without at least one Muggle pilot or customs inspector noticing defies all sense of probability. Even if the Ministry used the most powerful concealment charms, the dragons left behind physical evidence, scorched trees, broken boulders, and the carcasses of unfortunate livestock. Such traces would surely have prompted investigation, even if the witnesses could not remember exactly what they had seen. Norbert's departure was arranged in the dead of night when Charlie Weasley's friends arrived with a harness to airlift the dragon away. The logistics of flying a young but substantial dragon across Scotland were staggering. Rowling recounts, 4 broomsticks came swooping out of the darkness, yet the creature, noisy and incandescent with excitement, was somehow borne aloft and spirited away without any Muggle noticing a silhouette of wings blotting out the stars. It is perhaps the most flagrant example of the magical world brushing perilously close to exposure, and it suggests that wizards trusted in secrecy more than reason. The presence of acromantulas, giant spiders the size of small cars in the Forbidden Forest, is another case where the ministry's nonchalance seems absurd. Aragog and his kin numbered in the hundreds, and they occasionally ranged beyond their hollow to hunt. Any Muggle exploring the forest would have seen webs as thick as ropes or tracks like bicycle tires pressed into the soil. Hagrid, in Chamber of Secrets, explained, "I let him loose in the forest. He lived there ever since." That forest was not fenced. Muggles hiking too far from Hogsmeade could have stumbled directly into Aragog's lair. And no obliviation charm would erase the physical evidence of webbing, carcasses, and the enormous tunnel entrances. The case of Thestrals also raises questions. These skeletal, leathery-winged horses drew the Hogwarts carriages for years, and while they were invisible to those who had never seen death, they were perfectly visible to anyone who had. It is not implausible that a Muggle gamekeeper or forester might have witnessed a Thestral in flight or grazing in a clearing. The sight of such a creature, with great black bat-like wings, as Rowling describes them, would have caused a panic severe enough to make newspaper headlines. It seems improbable that all Muggles lacked the specific experience required to perceive them. Even smaller magical pets could have prompted suspicion. Crookshanks, Hermione's part-Kneazle cat, possessed an intelligence far beyond any ordinary feline. When he cooperated with Sirius Black, he carried messages and manipulated doors. Any observant Muggle would have noticed the creature's uncanny behavior. In the text, Rowling writes, Crookshanks darted forward and seized the bag in his mouth. A cat opening locked doors and collaborating with a supposed stray dog was the stuff of fairy tales, and yet no Muggle ever reported it. Owls delivered letters in daylight, swooping in broad arcs over Muggle villages. Hogwarts acceptance letters flew in droves to Privet Drive, creating a frenzy of parchment and feathers. While Uncle Vernon did everything to stop the letters, neighbours surely must have glimpsed dozens of owls congregating over the roof. In Sorcerer's Stone, the text reads, "The Dursleys ducked as two owls swooped overhead." Even in London, during Harry's visit to Diagon Alley, an owl post office operated in the open. Yet there is no mention of any Muggle ever asking why so many owls behaved like miniature postmen. Magical beasts left behind more than footprints. They carried diseases, shed scales and feathers, and emitted sounds no naturalist could classify. In the wizarding world, these were ordinary nuisances, but for Muggles, they would have been unmistakable evidence of something unnatural. One imagines the puzzled local veterinarian examining singed livestock, or the suspicious constable tracing enormous claw marks that stopped abruptly as if the creature had taken flight. The true marvel is not the wizard's ability to tame such beasts, but their unshakable confidence that Muggles would never look too closely. The secrecy was not enforced by spells alone, but by a collective willingness to ignore what was inconvenient. Wizards trusted that Muggles were incurious or fearful, and that when confronted with a glimpse of magic, they would simply look away. But as Norbert's roar echoed through the night, or Buckbeak's talons churned the soil, one cannot help but suspect that somewhere someone did see and chose never to tell. Number 21. Magical shops and dark alleyways. Flourish and Blots, the renowned bookshop of Diagon Alley, had always stood as a beacon of magical literature, but it was not the only establishment serving the needs of witches and wizards. Hidden among the twisting alleys of London were lesser-known shops whose very existence should have provoked the curiosity and suspicion of Muggles. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Harry first encounters Nocturne Alley, a dim labyrinth of narrow passageways crowded with shops that traded in sinister curiosities. The moment he stumbled into Borgin and Burke's, the air grew thick with the scent of decay and the echo of old enchantments. The shop was filled with cursed cabinets, tarnished amulets, and grim-looking jars containing substances that would terrify any ordinary person. Yet somehow no Muggle ever seemed to notice a steady trickle of customers disappearing into that shadowy street behind the leaky cauldron. When Harry observed the hag-like witch examining a tray of human-looking fingernails, he felt a chill that lingered even after he returned to Diagon Alley. The grimy windows of Borgin and Burke's revealed only vague silhouettes, but the storefront was still a solid, physical space in the heart of London. It defied logic that Muggles, renowned for their curiosity and their habit of peering through every doorway and window, never filed a report or rang the constable. The Ministry of Magic employed enchantments to repel Muggles, yet the sheer scale of foot traffic into these shops, some clients clad in bright robes or carrying wriggling parcels, seemed impossible to hide forever. Wizards were not always discreet. Mrs. Weasley once bustled out of the apothecary with a bag of glittering beetle eyes and an armful of powdered root of asphodel. In a city that never slept, someone should have noticed. Even within Diagon Alley, Flourish and Blots was occasionally visited by witches who forgot to adjust their hats or left the door ajar just long enough for a passerby to glimpse shelves lined with books that hissed or screamed. If any Muggle child had pressed a face to the glass, they would have seen volumes bound in scaly leather and titles like Curses and Counter-Curses by Professor Vindictus Viridian. A sight like that was unlikely to slip the notice of Londoners, many of whom were quick to suspect illegal activity or occult practices. It was hardly rare for curious reporters to prowl Charing Cross Road in search of a scandal, yet they never stumbled upon a witch fumbling with a cauldron too large to conceal under a coat. A particularly striking example lay in the cauldron shop, squeezed between a record store and a drab-off license on a street frequented by Muggle commuters. Its display window proudly showed pewter, brass and silver cauldrons stacked high like metal mushrooms. Harry, in Philosopher's Stone, noticed that the leaky cauldron looked small and shabby to Muggle eyes, but surely a shop selling cauldrons in the middle of London would have drawn some attention over time. Even if the sign was enchanted to appear faded or illegible, it was impossible to disguise the clamour of witches haggling over cauldron sizes. The tinkle of its doorbell and the occasional burst of blue smoke should have raised suspicion. The Ministry had a long tradition of concealing the magical world from Muggle scrutiny, but as Hermione explained in Order of the Phoenix, the statute of secrecy has been breached hundreds of times. Wizards relied on the belief that Muggles would rationalize anything too strange. If a cauldron rattled itself down the pavement, they might decide it was a publicity stunt. If a wizard in green robes dashed past with a howling package, they would convince themselves it was a prank. Still, the sheer absurdity of Nocturne Alley's existence, wedged in the labyrinth of London, suggested that at least a few observant souls must have realized something was terribly amiss. During the years when Lucius Malfoy frequented Borgin and Burke's to sell dark artifacts, the alley saw an uptick in traffic from wealthy pureblood families. Carriages pulled by thestrals, visible only to those who had witnessed death, sometimes paused just out of sight, their occupants emerging in rich, velvet cloaks. The leaky cauldron might have stood as the main portal, but a series of back entrances led discreetly into adjoining courtyards. Muggles were surely brushing past these thresholds daily, unaware that only a thin veil of charms separated them from a commerce in cursed opals and vanishing cabinets. If a journalist had once tried the door, they would have stepped into a gloom where the air was thick with old enchantments and the cloying scent of decay. And yet, in all the years of wizarding trade, no headlines ever appeared in the Evening Standard proclaiming the discovery of a black market in dark magic. The oddity extended beyond Nocturne Alley. Slug and Jigger's apothecary with its barrels of bat spleens and bundles of dried nettles should have alarmed any health inspector or concerned parent. The door swung open constantly to allow witches with sick children to fetch fresh potions. Sometimes, to the consternation of shop assistants, a jar of bubotuber pus would overturn and dribble onto the threshold. No one placed a warning cone or a polite sign. In any ordinary city, that would have sparked inquiries and sanitation violations, but London, somehow remained oblivious. It was as though the collective mind of Muggle London simply refused to see. In Knockturn Alley, a narrow staircase climbed to a second-hand robe shop called Mulpepper's Cloaks. Its proprietor, a stooped witch with a monocle, was known for mending invisibility cloaks and re-enchanting protective charms. Harry never entered that shop himself, but Fred and George once described it in detail, pointing out that it was only a few doors from a Muggle-owned print shop. The separation was no more than a brick wall, one side humming with sorcery, the other occupied by ordinary men setting type for church bulletins and restaurant menus. The proximity of these worlds felt so preposterous that the mind balked. How did no Muggle ever step around the corner and glimpse a witch wrestling a shrinking wardrobe through the doorway? In Half-Blood Prince, Harry trailed Draco Malfoy through Knockturn Alley and into a hidden side corridor that led to the back door of Borgin and Burke's. From there, Draco emerged into a shabby courtyard that, by any reckoning, should have shared an alleyway with Muggle shops. The enchantments must have been prodigiously powerful to keep this bustling trade in sinister goods forever hidden from the public eye. But wizards were not flawless. Arthur Weasley once remarked, "It's the leaks that worry me, the little things, the things that slip through the cracks. A shop selling cursed necklaces and Hand of Glory lanterns should not have been able to conduct business unseen." At times, the issue seemed to come down to sheer brazenness. Wizards dressed in outlandish combinations, lime green bowler hats and trailing violet cloaks, marched through the leaky cauldron or knocked on the back door of apothecary shops without a second thought. Some carried familiars in cages, screeching magpies, puffs kinds that hummed and jiggled. They trusted the statute of secrecy to keep Muggle eyes sliding away, to make the mind believe it saw nothing but an empty doorway. If ever the enchantments faltered, if ever a child in the crowd refused to look away, the masquerade could have collapsed in an instant. Beyond the famous alleys there were also roving peddlers of magically goods. In Goblet of Fire, Fred and George boasted of acquiring Peruvian instant darkness powder, a commodity rarely sold in Diagon Alley itself. Such rarities were more often hawked by travelling vendors who set up stalls at the edge of Muggle neighbourhoods. It defied belief that no one ever wondered why strangers in dragonhide boots unloaded crates of glowing powder under cover of twilight. Even if the merchandise was wrapped in burlap, the occasional spark or squawk from the depths of a crate must have caused a double take from a passing cyclist or a shopkeeper closing up for the night. The wizarding world's secrecy rested on a fragile assumption that Muggles could be counted upon to ignore the improbable. And so, for centuries, shops like Borgin and Burke's thrived just steps from Muggle thoroughfares, their windows blacked out or charmed to repel attention. Yet every time a delivery cart rumbled past, every time a young wizard emerged clutching a sack of bloodroot or a stack of spellbooks, the spell of concealment was tested anew. Number 22, flying on broomsticks. It is a curious absurdity tucked into the shadows of wizarding Britain that witches and wizards, in the secrecy of night, take to the skies on broomsticks with the nonchalance of cyclists on country lanes. The books tell us matter-of-factly that this is carefully monitored by the Ministry of Magic, that the Department of Magical Transportation ensures secrecy. Yet no matter how carefully monitored, it strains belief that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of broomstick flights over the decades never once sparked a major Muggle incident. The United Kingdom is a webwork of motorways lit like braids of neon, crowded rail lines humming at all hours, and aircraft vectoring in endless patient lines for Heathrow and Gatwick. Even in the 1990s, Harry's time, it was a country of traffic jams under sodium lamps and pilots scanning the dark for warning lights. And still, according to wizarding authorities, the Muggle world remained blissfully unaware of human shapes on broomsticks skimming the rooftops of London or the lonely fields of Yorkshire. Consider, for example, the night Harry is transported from Privet Drive in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. In that scene, a dozen witches and wizards soar over the suburbs on broomsticks, Tonks swooping with neon-coloured hair and moody barking orders. J.K. Rowling writes they were flying in formation, Harry in the centre, all keeping a watchful eye for Muggle eyes below. It is a good line, but imagine the reality. Surrey's suburbs glow with the orange. Haze of street lamps. In the 1990s, the M25 roared in constant use. Anyone awake at 1 a.m., insomniac pensioners, shift workers, taxi drivers, might glance out and see human figures blotting out the moon, broom handles shining in reflected light. Worse still, these flights took them close to central London, where even at night the skyline burns with office lights and riverside pubs hum with drinkers. Yet the Ministry insists on total success in evasion. Whoosh. There is a line in Quidditch through the ages that suggests centuries of regulation. Broomstick flights are subject to strict Ministry controls to avoid being seen by Muggles. But what does that mean in practice? Imagine the sheer bureaucracy. Someone in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes monitoring every broom leaving Diagon Alley, checking flight plans. Arthur Weasley once said, "We're not supposed to use magic in front of Muggles." But what about the pilots circling above London at 5,000 feet? Even if they didn't see individual faces, a radar operator might pick up something strange on a clear night, a moving object without a transponder signal. In Harry's world, Muggle aviation is rarely mentioned except to be dismissed with a casual laugh, as if radar technicians would see someone on a broom and say, "Oh, just a bird," and turn back to their tea. The question becomes even more pressing when you consider that broomstick flight is not reserved for emergencies or clandestine transport of the boy who lived. Fred and George Weasley, for instance, are notorious for using their brooms at odd hours, practicing Quidditch manoeuvres at dawn. Hogwarts itself hosts Quidditch matches high over the grounds. Granted, it is in the Highlands, remote and misty, but the Scottish Highlands are not empty. Hikers, shepherds, military training flights, even the occasional news helicopter could catch a glint of sunlight on polished broom bristles. We're told Dumbledore is confident the school is unplottable and well warded, yet the broader countryside remains dotted with human presence. The wizarding world seems to rely on a faith in luck and confusion more than airtight secrecy. The absurdity of perfect secrecy is never more obvious than in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone when Harry receives his Nimbus 2000. Professor McGonagall says flatly, "You'll need to be careful. First years aren't usually allowed their own brooms." But she does not say, "You'll need ministry clearance for night flights over Oxfordshire." We are left to assume that the school staff trust teenage boys not to zip into the night sky on a dare. Yet these are the same staff who forbid wandering the corridors after curfew, as if that were the greater threat to secrecy. The mismatch between their paranoia over magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest and their indifference to broomstick misuse is stark, and one can only imagine how many near misses the Ministry Obliviators have had to handle. Perhaps the most telling moment comes in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows in the chaotic, desperate Seven Potters flight. Harry is disguised as multiple decoys. Hagrid rides Sirius's flying motorbike. Moody and others deploy protective spells. And yet their plan hinges on splitting up and making for the countryside at speed. Death Eaters attack them over dark fields. If there was ever a time for Muggle witnesses, that would be it. The narrative mentions a few Muggle homes glowing below as they pass, but there is no mention of anyone running outside to see sparks in the sky. No report of the Ministry rushing in to obliviate entire villages. Are we to believe that in the whole of southern England every window stayed dark, every dog failed to bark, every RAF radar sweep was blank? A single incident would be enough to shake the statute of secrecy to its roots. The Ministry's line is that it has never happened at scale, yet there are tantalizing hints that they have had close calls. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Harry inflates Aunt Marge and runs away, he sees Muggles staring as the night bus screeched to a halt in front of them. Here, the Ministry accepts that minor exposures occur and that they clean them up rapidly. But what about when entire squads of auras fly over suburbia? One might expect dozens of calls to local police about flying figures. In the real world, 911 and 989 operators routinely field UFO reports, even for Chinese lanterns or drones. The idea that no one ever reported people on sticks in the sky seems absurd. There is also the problem of wizarding sports. Quidditch is described in Quidditch Through the Ages as so beloved that games are played in many regions. The Ministry organises anti-Muggle protections like the Muggle repelling charm, but even in canon these sometimes fail. At the Quidditch World Cup in Goblet of Fire, Arthur Weasley warns about the risk of Muggle discovery despite elaborate measures. If they struggle to hide 100,000 wizards camping in a field, how can they guarantee that 10 kids practicing at dusk in Devonshire remain unseen? Wizards are famously careless. Even Hermione says in Order of the Phoenix, honestly, it's like they think the statute of secrecy doesn't apply to them. She's talking about Harry and the DA, but the accusation suits many adult wizards just as well. In truth, the books gloss over the reality of modern surveillance. Britain's civil aviation is governed by meticulous rules. Every pilot files a flight plan. Air traffic controllers monitor the skies. Even in Harry's day, Heathrow alone handled 60 million passengers annually, with planes stacked in holding patterns over the southeast. A broom crossing such a path would show up on primary radar, if only as an odd blip. One can argue that the Ministry can fundus enchants radar operators or magically scrambles signals, but the scale of this conspiracy would be astonishing. Every control tower, every weather radar technician, it would be the greatest cover-up in history. And if that were true, surely someone would talk. Conspiracies are brittle things. Even Muggles in Rowling's world aren't fools. In Half-Blood Prince, Prime Minister Fudge admits to meeting his Muggle counterpart, implying that the highest levels of government know of magic. But what about the police constable in Kent, who sees a broom pass over the motorway? The train driver out of Euston who watches a figure soaring alongside? The night shift cleaner at Stansted Control Tower who overhears weird objects on the radar? Are we to assume the Obliviators get them all, every single time, without exception? There's also the question of sound. Broomsticks may be sleek, but they are not silent. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry's firebolt is described as whistling through the air. On a still night, over silent fields, that sound would carry. Imagine a couple camping in the Downs, hearing an unmistakable human whoop above them, or a dog walker near Hogsmeade Village watching dark shapes crossing the moon. The books dismiss these risks with a hand wave, but they are inescapable in a real, densely inhabited country. Indeed, one of the most damning pieces of evidence that broomsticks should have been seen comes in Chamber of Secrets. When Harry and Ron steal the flying Ford Anglia, they are spotted repeatedly. Rowling writes, "It was a very odd sort of flight. Muggles down below pointed and stared. The Ministry is furious, but if a car in the sky is so noticeable, why not a broom? Both are unlit objects moving unnaturally. The only difference is that the broom lacks a windshield. It seems less that broomsticks are better hidden and more that the books choose not to mention the obvious consequences." We also see that the Ministry has a special department for memory modification. Gilderoy Lockhart boasted of his skill with memory charms. Arthur Weasley mentions the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad. These are not small outfits. Their very existence implies constant breaches. The wizarding world depends on forgetting spells to plug leaks, but if leaks were so rare, why keep an entire bureaucracy? In truth, the books betray themselves. They admit the leaks are constant, but then ask us to forget that broomstick flights, the most vulnerable exposure of all, somehow remain perfectly hidden. Perhaps the most realistic interpretation is that the Ministry is engaged in constant damage control. They cannot stop all sightings, but they bury them under ridicule, confusion, and swift memory wipes. When Muggles call in UFO reports, the Ministry may intervene before the tabloids can latch on. In this reading, the statute of secrecy is a perpetual triage, an exhausting game of whack-a-mole. It is less a perfect veil and more an ever-patched tapestry of half-truths. Wizards, for all their arrogance, live in constant fear of exposure. And broomstick flights, those romantic, moonlit arcs over hedgerows, are the biggest risk of all. Number 23, Muggle-born children in the Muggle world. The narrow brick building at the corner of Fawcett Lane was unremarkable to the casual eye, a low-roofed structure squeezed between a fishmonger and a disused laundrette. Yet this was the temporary lodging for children who were neither fully of the Muggle world nor fully of the magical one. It was called Willowbrook Children's Home, an innocuous name chosen by the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes to disguise its true purpose. From the outside, passers-by saw the same scene every day, a pair of weary-looking women in cardigans bringing in shopping bags, a faded sign announcing Community Youth Centre, and the occasional delivery of books and toys. Nobody ever thought to question why no child ever seemed to leave or why the curtains were always drawn tight. The building's enchantments were not as foolproof as the Ministry liked to claim, but they were reliable enough to blur the minds of neighbours, ensuring that when strange things happened, everyone forgot by evening. It was in this building that an 8-year-old named Maeve Frobisher first caused every metal object in the kitchen to whirl into a violent cyclone, clattering pots slamming into the ceiling while spoons stabbed the walls like arrows. The cook, a stout Muggle woman named Mrs. Trimble, had burst into shrieks as the cutlery arranged itself in mid-air, forming a trembling constellation around Maeve's small, terrified face. Moments later, a wizard from the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad slipped through the back door. His name was Julian Greaves, and he had performed memory charms so often that he could recite the incantation in his sleep. Mrs. Trimble never remembered the incident. She merely complained for weeks about an odd draught that must have flung everything about. Yet the gouges in the plaster remained, and other employees would later puzzle over them while never truly wondering how they had appeared. In the same home, a boy named Terence Boot once summoned a nest of grass snakes into the dormitory when he became enraged with another child. The snakes slithered over the sheets, forked tongues, tasting the air as Terence wept uncontrollably. When the house matron, Miss Ethel Leving, entered, she found him curled against the wall with his palms pressed over his ears. For a fleeting instant, she saw the reptiles arranged in a perfect circle around the boy like worshipful sentinels. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Later, she would recount the moment to her sister in hushed disbelief, but by dawn she could no longer recall the details. The memory charm settled over her thoughts like a fog, leaving behind only an unshakable unease. None of this was supposed to happen so close to Muggle life. According to the Ministry's own records, volumes of parchment labelled Child Enchantments, Pre-Hogwarts Manifestations, most incidents were contained by swift intervention. But the Ministry was not omniscient. For every official report there were a dozen unrecorded incidents, oddities that teachers or neighbours witnessed but could never explain. It was hardly credible to suggest that an entire neighbourhood could be bewitched into perpetual oblivion. And yet somehow this was precisely what occurred again and again. The concealment of Willowbrook and other such places depended on the same brittle assumptions that had hidden Harry Potter's true nature from the Dursleys' neighbours for 10 long years. Even Harry himself had once unintentionally performed feats that should have forced questions from the Muggles around him. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, he remembered the incident when Aunt Petunia had sheared off all his hair in a fit of spite, only to find it had regrown overnight. She had decided he needed a haircut and had cut it so short he was almost bald except for his fringe, which she left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, but the next morning when she saw that his hair was exactly as it had been before she'd cut it, she had screamed like a banshee. Aunt Petunia's reaction, while fierce, never extended to notifying the authorities or seeking medical advice. One might argue that fear and denial kept her silent. But what about the neighbours who must have glimpsed the oddities over the years the broken windows, the impossibly sudden escapes from Dudley's bullying, the conversations with snakes in the zoo. Some of the workers at Willowbrook did not fit neatly into the Muggle category. A few were squibs, their own faint, magical heritage entangling them with this hidden world they could not fully join. Martha Kettle, a kindly squib in her 50s, was assigned to supervise afternoon lessons. She could sense when a child was on the verge of magical outburst, a prickling in her palms, a faint buzzing in her ears, but she could do nothing to stop it. She often wondered whether she was a participant in deception or merely another victim. If Muggle social workers came for an inspection, the entire building would be enchanted to appear empty. The ministry claimed that no children were ever discovered. But Martha sometimes watched the Muggles standing on the pavement, frowning at the windows as though glimpsing a movement behind the curtains. Their eyes would slide away a moment later, vacant as sleepwalkers. On one occasion, a substitute teacher named Mr. Carroll was brought in when Miss Leving fell ill. Unlike the permanent staff, Mr. Carroll had no reason to suspect he was stepping into anything other than a charity-run day nursery. The children behaved nervously in his presence, as though aware that the protective layer of understanding was absent. During an art lesson, one boy, Arthur Cresswell, lifted a crayon that promptly ignited in his fist. A thin flame spiraled up like a candle wick. Mr. Carroll watched, open-mouthed, as Arthur seemed to panic, and the flame snuffed itself out without scorching the boy's skin. When the ministry wizard came to erase the memory, he found Mr. Carroll still standing with the crayon in his hand, repeating, "I must have imagined it." In the ministry's official record, the incident was filed as a minor exposure with no long-term contamination of Muggle perception. Even among those whose memories were modified, a residue of confusion remained. Years later, Mrs. Trimble confided to her niece that she had always believed something was peculiar about Willowbrook. She could never articulate why she avoided the rear kitchen or why she dreamed of children whose faces she couldn't see. It was as if her mind had developed a cyst around the tampered recollections, an aching pressure she could neither confront nor ignore. Memory. Charms were not delicate tools. They gouged out entire recollections, yet the shape of what had been removed sometimes left scars that bled into waking life. The ministry's insistence that Muggles never noticed anything has always rung hollow to those who have studied these cases. A society so saturated in surveillance and gossip could hardly fail to remark on children who set fire to curtains with a glance or made their classmates levitate in a fit of temper. And yet case after case demonstrated the same eerie outcome. An entire street might witness an impossibility, only for every witness to wake the next morning with nothing but an unaccountable dread, as though they had glimpsed something vast and incomprehensible. It was the same dread that filled the air when Harry Potter was posited at number 4 Privet Drive, a baby wrapped in blankets too fine for any orphanage. The cat that watched from the garden wall knew the truth. Professor McGonagall had sat there all day, observing the Muggle neighbourhood in which the boy would grow up, and she had seen precisely how blind the Muggle eye could be. Some argued that the statute of secrecy itself relied less on spells than on the simple disbelief of Muggle minds. People would do almost anything to maintain the illusion that their world was rational and safe. They would forget the impossible rather than confront it. And yet in places like Willowbrook, disbelief alone could not erase the evidence. The ministry needed whole teams of obliviators to scour the building of memory. In Order of the Phoenix, Hermione Granger once explained that the ministry's Office of Misinformation worked around the clock to cover up dragon sightings. If they could hide a dragon, it was hardly surprising that a dozen magically volatile children could be made invisible as well. Still, the truth persisted in small details. The scorch marks in the dormitory, the squeak of something scaly beneath the floorboards, the glint of a teaspoon embedded in the ceiling, Long after the Muggle minds had been cleared of suspicion, the physical traces lingered. No spell was strong enough to erase them entirely. These remnants were the proof that the magical and Muggle worlds did not coexist in tidy separation. They bled into each other in ways no law could fully contain. And perhaps that is why, for all its procedures and official statements, the Ministry never issued a formal explanation of Willowbrook's existence. It was simpler to let the Muggles forget, to trust that the curtain of confusion would always fall. But those who had seen even a sliver of the truth never quite stopped feeling that something was wrong, that the world was stranger than they dared to imagine. Number 24. The Forbidden Forest and Magical Creatures. The Forbidden Forest, sprawling across the edge of the Hogwarts grounds, looms like a primeval riddle waiting to be uncovered by unsuspecting Muggles. Its tangled canopy shelters a population of magical creatures so astonishing that their mere existence challenges every boundary of human understanding. It is difficult to reconcile the idea that such a kingdom of wonders and terrors could remain hidden in modern Britain, a country whose every inch has been charted, photographed and studied by cartographers, hikers and farmers. Yet the Ministry of Magic would have the wizarding world believe that no Muggle hunter ever strayed too far beyond the tree line, that no curious naturalist ever heard the guttural roar of a passing troll echoing over the hills. The truth, however, can be glimpsed in moments when the forest nearly revealed itself, moments that the books and films gloss over as if by unspoken agreement. One need only recall the panicked memories of Hagrid himself, who once admitted that the forest was full of things that shouldn't be let out. Consider the incident recorded in a confidential ministry report during the tenure of Cornelius Fudge, when a team of Muggle conservationists from the Forestry Commission set out to survey the northern glade. The team, led by a man named Gerald Pritchard, brought with them sophisticated motion-sensing cameras and a thermal drone to monitor wildlife. It was precisely this sort of scrutiny that the ministry feared most. That morning, their equipment registered a heat signature the size of a cottage, a shape with 8 sprawling limbs that crept across the moss. The team was convinced they had stumbled upon an undocumented species of giant arachnid and had begun preparations to alert the press. Only the sudden intervention of Arthur Weasley, dispatched with a squad of obliviators, prevented headlines about the enormous spider colony of Scotland. By afternoon, the Muggles' memories were scoured clean, the cameras replaced with falsified recordings of deer. It is unsettling to reflect on how close the magical world came to exposure because of the arrogance that no Muggle would ever look too closely. After all, the Forbidden Forest is not a distant wilderness. It stands within the same landscape as villages like Hogsmeade and the market towns that dot the Highlands. To imagine that no hikers or birdwatchers have ever wandered near enough to glimpse a herd of centaurs grazing under moonlight seems naive. Even the books hint at this when Firenze emerges from the trees to carry Harry to safety. Firenze suddenly reared onto his hind legs in Harry's defense, Rowling writes, and the centaur's hooves thudded against the leaf litter. Such thunderous sounds would have carried beyond the perimeter of the trees, drifting toward Muggle ears. The centaurs themselves are hardly discreet. They shoot arrows in the dark, their campfires burning low in clearings visible between the trunks. Bane, Ronan, and Megorian are known to engage in loud debates about Mars and omens of doom, voices that must echo on the cold air. On certain windless nights, local shepherds might have heard fragments of these arguments carried like disembodied chants over the fields. But perhaps the most vivid example of the forest nearly betraying its secrets came when Buckbeak, the proud hippogriff, broke free during the events of Prisoner of Azkaban. Fleeing execution, Buckbeak launched into the sky with Sirius Black clinging to his neck. Witnesses later claimed to have seen a silhouette, like a monstrous bird, soaring above the treetops, a vision that sparked a flurry of calls to the Aviary Society of Inverness. Once again, the ministry dispatched obliviators in the dead of night. One might argue that enchantments and Muggle-repelling charms account for this secrecy. Indeed, Dumbledore himself told Harry that the grounds were well protected. But charms have limits, especially when confronted by technology. In modern times, drones and satellite imaging penetrate illusions with ease. The notion that Muggles simply never noticed the footprints of trolls the size of boulders or webs as wide as cottages strains belief. The Acromantulas, first bred by Newt Scamander's acquaintances and later released into the forest, construct silk dens that defy concealment. Aragog, the patriarch spider, was described as the size of a small elephant with eyes milky white in the gloom. When Hagrid tried to keep him hidden, it was a losing battle against nature's colossal scale. One can almost picture the scene if a Muggle naturalist, perhaps a woman named Harriet Cole from the Royal Entomological Society, had pressed deeper into the forest on a research trip. Equipped with insect sampling nets and a field guide, she might have discovered a glistening tunnel spun between the trunks, the strands thicker than her wrist. Stepping closer to examine the webbing, she would have heard the rasping hiss of Aragog's offspring moving in the darkness. No charm could muffle the rustle of thousands of armoured legs, nor disguise the sweet, sick smell of carcasses stored for feeding. And yet no such discovery is ever acknowledged in the Wizarding Chronicles. The question then arises, was it negligence or was it willful disregard to assume Muggles would never draw near? In Chamber of Secrets, Hagrid tells Harry and Ron to follow the spiders, and their trail leads to a veritable city of arachnids. The giant spider's pincers clicked menacingly, Rowling records, an image that suggests a sound unmistakable to any nearby human. At that moment, with Aragog's legion swarming toward the boys, the cacophony must have been loud enough to carry beyond the edge of the trees. What if a farmer driving past on an early morning delivery had pulled over to investigate? Even the centaur's culture seems too visible to remain forever unremarked upon. They breed foals, teach archery, gather herbs in glades. When Firenze was banished from his herd for aiding Dumbledore, he carried an air of solemn pride that could never have passed unnoticed if any Muggle eyes had glimpsed him. To see such a being, a fusion of man and stallion, with a chest the breadth of a barrel, would have inspired an entire generation of folklore, more vivid than any ghost story. Trolls, too, pose a hazard to secrecy. The three-headed dog Fluffy was removed from the forest only by Hagrid's personal intervention, but the trolls remained. Their footprints are immense, and their battles shake the very roots of the trees. When Quirinus Quirrell brought a troll into Hogwarts Castle, he did so because trolls had been familiar sights within the forest's interior. It is absurd to suppose their bellowing went unnoticed by passing hikers, as if Muggles were deaf to the tremors that surely rippled outward. No less improbable is the notion that no Muggle children ever dared one of those reckless dares to sneak past the tree line. Imagine two boys from a nearby hamlet determined to prove their courage by stealing an acorn from the forbidden forest. The moment they stepped into the shadows, they would have been struck by the unnatural silence that follows an intruder. Yet the instant the centaur's arrows thudded into the soil as a warning, the boys' screams would have shattered any illusion of secrecy. The Ministry's reliance on memory charms is a fragile solution. Obliviation is not perfect, and there are records, sealed in Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, of individuals whose minds could not be fully scrubbed clean. Rumours spread in nearby villages of horsemen and talking spiders. Though the wizarding authorities treat these as harmless local legends, they are the last echoes of encounters too startling to be forgotten altogether. The forest's defences, the enchantments, the charms, the misdirection, function not as an impenetrable barrier, but as a net riddled with holes. Each generation of magical creatures grows bolder. Each new magical artifact hidden among the trees increases the risk of discovery. It is only by a combination of bureaucratic denial and relentless intervention that the world remains unaware, but those who have glimpsed the shadows moving among the trunks know the truth. The forbidden forest is not as forbidden as the Ministry would like to believe. Number 25. Sirius Black's arrest and disguise. When Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, the wizarding world fell into immediate panic, and the Daily Prophet wasted no time in plastering his gaunt, haunted face on every front page. Even Fudge himself said in Prisoner of Azkaban, "We've never had a breakout before. It's unheard of." Yet the same wizarding authorities who feared him so deeply failed to consider the glaring absurdity of him living in the heart of London, undetected by millions of Muggles. The Ministry issued wanted posters that screamed, "Have you seen this wizard?" with his screaming visage contorted in rage, but no one paused to ask how no Muggle constable, street camera, or concerned Londoner noticed a ragged man who looked exactly like Britain's most wanted convict. Harry himself sees Sirius in London in the form of a filthy vagrant with long black hair and a wild, desperate gaze, something any Muggle police officer would have detained instantly for vagrancy or even simple questioning. Sirius didn't just hide in the forests and outskirts. He was described as lurking around Hogwarts in animagus form, but in Order of the Phoenix he was specifically stated to be holed up in Grimmauld Place, number 12, which sat right between numbers 11 and 13 in a respectable Muggle street in Islington, a house that literally squeezed itself into view in front of two Muggle neighbours. Mrs. Black's portrait screamed insults about Muggles in a voice so loud that the Order had to yank curtains closed, yet apparently the Muggle neighbours were none the wiser. Even the building's bizarre structural transformations escaped detection, which seems improbable in a modern city with nosy neighbours, postal workers, and city inspectors. One cannot help but wonder if the Ministry had to send out obliviators daily to keep the illusion intact. The question grows even more glaring when you remember London is bristling with CCTV cameras. Even in the 1990s, the UK was famously fond of monitoring its streets, train stations, and parks. A homeless man with tangled hair and a look of violent rage who matched the front page of every wizarding newspaper could hardly stroll through King's Cross or sleep in Leicester Square without being seen. Security officers might not have known he was Sirius Black, mass murderer, and Azkaban escapee, but they'd have spotted a vagrant behaving strangely. Reports would have flooded local police departments. "There's a man yelling at shadows in Hyde Park," or "Someone who fits the murder suspect's description is sleeping in Charing Cross." Even if the Muggle police didn't know to look for Sirius, they'd have detained him on general suspicion. Moreover, there's the curious mention in Prisoner of Azkaban that Muggles were told he was armed and dangerous. "The Muggle news is full of reports about Black," Mr. Weasley says, warning Harry. This means the wizarding authorities deliberately created a Muggle cover story that made them aware of a fugitive on the run. Yet that same plan seems terribly sloppy if they didn't actually want Muggles to catch him or see him. Did the Ministry expect the public to call Scotland Yard if they saw Sirius, only to obliviate the police afterward? How many police officers had to have their memories erased after pulling over a man fitting Black's description? Did they let him go each time? It's a comedic image if you think about it. Sirius arrested by bobbies, then quietly released, when the obliviators show up over and over for months. Even more baffling is the fact that Sirius Black was not a subtle man. He was described as gaunt, with long matted hair and a haunted look, so distinctive that even Muggles would recognize it. In Goblet of Fire, Sirius tells Harry he couldn't risk buying food, so he stole it in his animagus form. But when not in animagus form, he had to sleep somewhere. In a city like London, there are hostels, squats, parks, tube stations, and abandoned buildings, but all of these are patrolled or observed in some fashion. Any social worker, police patrol, or even concerned citizen might have attempted to interact with a thin, raving homeless man who resembled the subject of an armed and dangerous alert. The scale of ignoring him beggars belief. Harry even sees Sirius in his dog form on Privet Drive, describing him as massive, shaggy, and black as coal. This is not a subtle animal in suburban Surrey. He is described as a grim by wizarding children, but to a Muggle he would look like a stray dog of unusual size and menace. Muggle authorities would, logically, have noticed a giant stray terrorizing the suburbs, especially given the British tendency to call animal control on dogs without collars. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Cornelius Fudge boasts about how carefully they're monitoring everything, yet they don't consider that their most wanted man is so conspicuous even in animagus form. Even number 12 Grimmauld Place itself is a problem. The Fidelius charm hides the location, but the text describes the building as squeezing itself into view, physically forcing the neighbouring houses aside. It was as though a brick wall had split open. This is not something easily missed by the neighbours next door. What did the Muggles in number 11 and 13 think was happening? The constant banging, the ugly windows appearing, Mrs. Black's shrieking portrait. Did they hear none of it? Even the most powerful memory charms would struggle with frequency and volume if obliviators had to visit every time a neighbour peeked out their window. In Order of the Phoenix, Sirius himself becomes frustrated by his imprisonment in Grimmauld Place. He wants to leave, to do something, but it's clear he paces around the house, growing increasingly reckless. The book says he transforms into Padfoot to slip out and accompany Harry to King's Cross. Imagine the risk, a known fugitive who can't help returning to the one train station, crawling with Muggles, where he's likely to be spotted. And yet apparently no Muggle traveller, no ticket inspector, no security camera notices a filthy vagrant or his giant dog. Even if Harry and friends dismissed the dog as harmless, Muggle police would have seen danger, or at least suspicion. And let's not forget Sirius's wanted posters are enchanted to scream. In Prisoner of Azkaban, these are magical, but the Ministry also says they adapted Muggle news to carry alerts. The Muggle Prime Minister has been told Sirius Black is armed and dangerous, says Fudge. This means actual Muggle newspapers and broadcasts showed his face. Millions of Muggles were warned to look for a man with long black hair and crazed eyes, and yet when he sleeps in alleyways, steals scraps from bins, and skulks around London's grimmier districts, not one of them recognizes him from the news, not one phone call to the police. It's also worth asking how Sirius navigated London. He was on the run for months. Did he ride buses, walk everywhere, use the underground? The London Tube is a warren of cameras, attendants, and vigilant passengers. In the 1990s, homeless people on the underground often got moved along by transport police or station managers. A wild-eyed vagrant would have been noticed even if no one guessed he was a wizard. That he never drew attention despite being a magical fugitive with a nationally broadcast warning is an enormous stretch of narrative convenience. Even more damning is the Ministry of Magic's attitude toward Muggles. In Half-Blood Prince, they openly communicate with the Prime Minister to discuss dangerous magical threats. "You're not suggesting the Inferi were behind those bridge collapses?" the Prime Minister asks. The Minister for Magic admits they know Muggles will see these things. They can't hide all disasters. Yet for Sirius's manhunt, they act like it's easy to keep everything silent despite a fugitive living in the most surveilled city in Europe. One might argue that the Ministry used obliviators to wipe Muggle memories, but memory charms are described in Chamber of Secrets as imprecise. Lockhart makes a mess of it. Even trained obliviators, we're told, can cause memory damage. Doing this to dozens or hundreds of witnesses who might spot Sirius daily would lead to rumours, gaps, and hospitalizations. St. Mungo's has an entire ward for obliviate accidents, proving memory charms aren't foolproof. How did they stop rumours of the man who disappears or the dog that talks from spreading? In Goblet of Fire, Arthur Weasley warns Harry that Muggles do notice magic when they aren't carefully managed. The Quidditch World Cup disaster is a perfect example. Even with hundreds of Ministry workers on site, Muggles see a dark mark in the sky. "We can't keep this quiet," Arthur says grimly. How then does the Ministry keep Sirius Black quiet while he wanders London for months? The scale of required cover-up is bigger than the Quidditch World Cup fiasco, but no one seems to comment on it in-universe. Finally, there's Sirius himself. He was not a polished spy. He was emotional, reckless, and prone to dramatic gestures. He slashed the fat lady's portrait to get into Gryffindor Tower. He broke into Hogwarts despite Dementors on guard. He shouted at Snape in Grimmauld Place so loudly that Molly Weasley had to intervene. This is not a man who could play the part of a silent ghost in a city of millions. He would have gotten into fights, stolen food, slept in doorways, left witnesses behind. His animagus form might help, but even a giant black dog is not invisible in London. The wizarding world's faith in secrecy here seems almost willfully blind. The entire storyline of Sirius's freedom depends on an uneasy bargain with logic. That Muggles can be fooled endlessly, that cameras fail to capture him, that police ignore him, that no social worker or neighbour sees him and calls it in. It is a compelling, dramatic arc, but one that cracks under scrutiny, because in the heart of London, with millions of eyes and hundreds of cameras, it is impossible to believe no one saw Sirius Black. Number 26. Millennium Bridge Collapse. The Millennium Bridge scene in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince film is one of the most visually striking moments in the entire series, showing Death Eaters swooping through London, blasting the bridge from its foundations and sending screaming pedestrians plunging into the Thames. It's cinematic, terrifying, and unforgettable, but for any reader or viewer trying to reconcile this with J.K. Rowling's carefully constructed magical world, it poses an enormous logical problem. How could something so catastrophic, so public, so thoroughly documented by news cameras and witnessed by hundreds of Muggles, be covered up by the Ministry of Magic? In the books, we see Death Eater attacks in the Muggle world, but they're always carefully ambiguous or plausibly explained away. The Brockdale Bridge collapse in the novel is described in vague terms that can be blamed on weather and bad engineering, but in the film, the Millennium Bridge is destroyed in broad daylight in central London with clear magical interference, and the narrative simply moves on. Consider the setting of the bridge itself. Opened in 2000, the Millennium Bridge is a pedestrian suspension bridge linking St. Paul's Cathedral with the Tate Modern and Shakespeare's Globe. In real life, it famously wobbled when it first opened, but by the time of the film's events, it was fully functional and heavily used. The film shows it crumbling as if a vast magical force shreds its steel supports and shatters its concrete deck. People flee in panic. The whole structure coils and collapses into the river. It is filmed as an unmistakable act of magical terrorism. There is no suggestion of bad weather, bombs, or structural failure. Even in the Harry Potter universe, it would be impossible to pass off that level of destruction as anything other than a deliberate attack. Hundreds would have witnessed it from nearby buildings. London's CCTV network would have captured every moment. The modern city is layered with security systems, news crews, rescue teams, and forensic engineers who would pick apart every detail. It is inconceivable that all of them could be obliterated. In the books, the Ministry of Magic has entire departments devoted to keeping magic hidden. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes has the Obliviator headquarters and the Muggle-worthy Excuse Committee. We even get a sense of how seriously they take this job in Order of the Phoenix, when Arthur Weasley struggles to explain away a flying car crashing into the Whomping Willow. I had to go to work early to deal with the Muggle catastrophe. That car was seen by no less than 7 Muggles. 7. And that is enough to warrant hours of work and multiple memory charms. 7 witnesses versus the hundreds on the Millennium Bridge. There is no spell in the books that would feasibly erase an entire city's memory, rewrite the CCTV archives, suppress the news broadcasts, and silence the rescuers who pulled survivors from the river. The film version demands that we accept that this was possible without a second thought. One might point to the fact that the books do depict attacks on Muggles, but they're always described in subtle ways that allow the Muggle world to rationalize them. The collapse of the Brockdale Bridge in Half-Blood Prince, the novel, is introduced in the Muggle Prime Minister's meeting with Fudge. 2 days ago, a hurricane blew in from the Atlantic and caused a great deal of damage. This explanation works because it's ambiguous enough. Death Eaters can create weather-based destruction that can be passed off as natural. The movie's version of the Millennium Bridge scene doesn't allow for that kind of ambiguity. A hurricane doesn't twist a modern steel bridge in seconds like a writhing serpent. It's explicitly magical in a way that the Muggle world can't ignore or misinterpret. There's also the issue of the timeline. In the film, the Millennium Bridge is destroyed very early in the story, in full daylight. That means the rest of the wizarding world has to deal with the consequences for months afterward. How do they stop Muggle engineers from investigating the debris and finding evidence of magical interference? How do they keep the newspapers from running witness interviews? How do they explain the deaths of those who fell into the river? Imagine an inquest where dozens of survivors all say the same thing. The bridge twisted and exploded for no reason. The film shows London in a state of fear after the attack, but the narrative doesn't bother to address how the magical world actually solves the problem. It simply assumes the Ministry is competent enough to erase everything, yet also incompetent enough to let it happen in the first place. Rowling's world has always balanced on the idea that Muggles are both oblivious and stubbornly rational. In Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore says, "Bless them. They'll go to any lengths to ignore magic, even if it's staring them in the face." But this is meant to explain small-scale oddities. A cat reading a map, people in cloaks celebrating in the streets, someone vanishing in a puff of smoke. It does not plausibly cover a catastrophic bridge collapse in the heart of one of the world's most surveilled cities. The Muggles in the Harry Potter world can rationalize strange things because the Ministry works hard to make them seem mundane, but there is no way to make the Millennium Bridge scene mundane. The book also shows us that Muggle leaders are informed of real magical threats. In Half-Blood Prince, Fudge visits the Muggle Prime Minister to warn him about Death Eater attacks. The Brockdale Bridge, that was us. The Ministry admits responsibility and tries to manage the fallout. Even then, they do it carefully, using natural disasters as cover. If the Millennium Bridge collapsed the way the film shows it, the Muggle Prime Minister would have demanded answers. He would have convened Cobra meetings. He would have brought in the army. The idea that he'd just nod and let the Ministry handle it strains all credibility, especially given that the Death Eaters are effectively declaring war on the Muggle world in that moment. Another problem is the magical community's own panic about being exposed. In the books, the Statute of Secrecy is sacred. It's why Hagrid is expelled for revealing magic in front of Muggles, why the Ministry is terrified of Sirius Black being seen, why Arthur Weasley's work is so important. Prisoner of Azkaban even features the Ministry threatening the entire school over a blown-up Aunt Marge. They're obsessed with keeping magic secret. So how does that fit with allowing Death Eaters to destroy a major London landmark in the middle of the day? If the Ministry really was that incompetent, the entire wizarding world would be in crisis. The International Confederation of Wizards would intervene. The Statute of Secrecy would be on the brink of collapse. If one tries to salvage the film's logic, it requires imagining the Ministry of Magic executing the most extreme cover-up in history. They'd have to obliviate every witness, doctor every video, silence every news outlet, control every social media feed, bribe or memory charm every first responder and engineer. Even if we allow for advanced magic, the scale of such an operation is absurd. The obliviators we see in the books don't work at that scale. When Gilderoy Lockhart tries to obliviate Harry and Ron with Ron's broken wand, it's a disaster. Memory charms are shown to be tricky, imperfect, even. Skilled wizards like Hermione warn about side effects. Doing it to thousands of Londoners would risk madness, suspicion, mass confusion. It's the kind of cover-up that breaks the internal rules of the wizarding world. And there's the matter of magical responsibility. In the books, the Ministry is shown as slow and bureaucratic, but they're not portrayed as willing to allow wholesale Muggles slaughter if they can help it. Cornelius Fudge and Rufus Scrimgeour may be morally compromised, but they do genuinely fear exposure. Even under Voldemort's secret rule in Deathly Hallows, the Ministry pretends to maintain the statute of secrecy. Yet the film suggests that either the Death Eaters felt so emboldened they didn't care about exposure, or the Ministry was powerless to stop them, and that afterward they somehow managed to clean it up perfectly. Neither option fits the tone of Rowling's world. A further issue is the way the magical world reacts to Muggle casualties. In Goblet of Fire, after the Quidditch World Cup disaster, they spend days hunting down Death Eaters who threatened Muggles. Even in Order of the Phoenix, when Harry and Dudley are attacked by Dementors, there's a full investigation. The idea that hundreds of Muggles could die on the Millennium Bridge without any serious reckoning or consequence for the Death Eaters or for the Ministry is unconvincing. The wizarding world is shown to care about avoiding open war with Muggles, not least because they'd likely lose. The statute of secrecy is there to protect wizards from Muggle fear and violence. Consider also that the scene itself, while thrilling, breaks the aesthetic of Rowling's magic. The magic in the books is often described as strangely subtle, even when deadly. In Deathly Hallows, the Battle of Hogwarts has enormous destruction, but it's all within Hogwarts. The Muggle world never sees giants rampaging through London. Even Voldemort's most brazen acts target magical places or people. The bridge scene in the film feels like a superhero movie set piece transplanted into a world that was never built for it. It's a betrayal of the careful balance Rowling struck between wonder and secrecy. This is not to say the scene is bad filmmaking. It's spectacular cinema, and David Yates directs it with real menace. The Death Eaters become true terrorists, cackling as they carve through London. It sets the tone of fear and vulnerability that the film needs, but it simply doesn't work with the world building. Fans who love the books notice the contradiction. If one accepts the movie's version of events as canon, it demands an explanation the script never gives. It expects us to believe that the Ministry can pull off a total information blackout in the centre of London without a trace, while being too incompetent to stop the attack in the first place. This gap becomes even clearer when we remember that the Statute of Secrecy is more than just an English law. It's enforced globally. In Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, we see how hard McCusa works to cover up a magical disaster in New York. The idea that the British Ministry could allow Death Eaters to destroy a major bridge in daylight and simply hush it up insults the intelligence of the audience. There would have been international magical intervention. The British Ministry would be facing censure from every wizarding government on Earth. Ultimately, the Millennium Bridge collapse is a moment where spectacle overrides internal consistency. It shows that the films wanted to raise the stakes to give the Muggle world a taste of Voldemort's terror. But it doesn't reckon with what that would mean. It's the cinematic equivalent of Chekhov's gun misfiring. It's a moment that demands a consequence the story refuses to deliver. It invites us to believe in a world where memory charms can erase news reports and forensic engineers alike, where the statute of secrecy is both inviolable and instantly disposable, and where London can lose an iconic landmark without leaving so much as a rumour behind. For many fans, it's a beautiful scene, but one that leaves behind an ugly hole in the magical world's logic.